The air in the makeshift theater was thick with the scent of pine wood, sweat, and disbelief. For the men of the Afrika Korps and the Wehrmacht, captured in the dust of Tunisia or the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, this was a reality more surreal than any fevered dream. They sat on simple wooden benches inside a hastily constructed barracks at Camp Como, Mississippi, a place that might as well have been on another planet. The lights dimmed, not with the abrupt finality of a prison blackout, but with the gentle fade of a grand spectacle about to begin. A projector whirred to life, its beam cutting a cone of dancing dust motes through the darkness. On the screen flickered the iconic MGM lion, its roar echoing through the humid southern air. For these German prisoners of war, this was not just a movie. It was a weapon, a psychological assault more potent and disorienting than any artillery barrage they had ever endured. They stared slack-jawed as a world they had been told was collapsing in on itself unfolded before them. A world of gleaming cars, immaculate suburban homes, refrigerators stocked with impossible amounts of food, and smiling, carefree people. This wasn't propaganda. It was too detailed, too casual, too real. The women on screen were not gaunt, hollow-eyed figures struggling for rations. They were vibrant, well-dressed, their laughter echoing a prosperity that felt like a deliberate mockery of the bombed-out ruins of Hamburg and Berlin. The men in the audience exchanged uneasy glances. This was America. The weak, decadent, mongrel nation that their Führer had assured them was teetering on the edge of oblivion. Yet what they were witnessing was a portrait of effortless, unassailable power. It wasn't a war film designed to intimidate them with tanks and planes. It was far more insidious. It was a simple romantic comedy, and it was systematically dismantling their entire worldview, one frame at a time. The seeds of doubt, planted the moment they first set foot on American soil, were beginning to germinate in the dark. They thought they understood the enemy. They were wrong. To comprehend the depth of their shock, one must first understand the world they came from. The mind of the German soldier in 1943 was a fortress constructed brick by Joseph Goebbels' masterful propaganda machine. For a decade, they had been fed a steady diet of carefully curated realities. They were the master race, the inheritors of a glorious destiny, led by an infallible Führer. Their enemies were caricatures of evil and weakness. The Soviets were subhuman Bolshevik hordes, driven only by commissars and brute force. The British were a crumbling colonial empire, effete and cowardly. But America was the ultimate paper tiger. It was a nation portrayed as a chaotic, jazz-addled society rotting from within. A place of gangsters, racial strife, and decadent capitalists, led by a crippled president. German newsreels showed breadlines from the Great Depression, images of striking workers being beaten by police, and sensationalized stories of crime in Chicago. The message was clear and relentless. America had no will to fight. Its people were soft, its industry was a shambles, and its military was a joke. A German officer captured in North Africa later recalled his briefings. "We were taught that the American soldier was a spoiled child of democracy," he said. "That he would not be able to withstand the rigors of modern warfare. We were told that he fights for money, not for ideals, and would quickly surrender when faced with the superior spirit of the German soldat." This was not just official doctrine, it was a deeply ingrained belief. They had seen the Reich's military might crush Poland in weeks, overrun France in a month, and drive deep into the heart of Russia. They were invincible. They believed their weapons were the best, their commanders the most brilliant, and their cause righteous. Their worldview was a hermetically sealed echo chamber, reinforcing their own perceived superiority. Capture, therefore, was not just a personal failure, but a confrontation with the unthinkable. And the America they were about to encounter was nothing like the one they had been promised. The journey into captivity was their first clue that the propaganda had been a lie. For most, it began in the overcrowded holds of Liberty ships, crossing the vast, submarine-infested Atlantic. They had been told the U-boat wolf packs owned these waters, that Allied shipping was being sent to the bottom faster than it could be built. Yet they sailed in massive convoys, protected by a seemingly endless screen of destroyers and patrol aircraft. The sheer scale of the operation was baffling. They landed in ports like Norfolk, Virginia, or New York City, expecting to see signs of a nation straining under the weight of a world war. They looked for rationing, for bomb damage, for the grim, determined faces of a populace under siege. They found none of it. Instead, they saw bustling harbors, skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, and streets filled with civilian traffic. There were no ruins. There were no craters. The war, it seemed, had not touched this continent. Their guards were not the savage brutes they had been warned about. They were young, often bored GIs who treated them with a perplexing indifference, sometimes even a casual kindness. They were handed cigarettes and candy bars, small gestures that chipped away at the image of a hateful enemy. Then came the trains. They were loaded onto passenger cars, not cattle wagons like the ones that transported prisoners across Europe. They were given seats. Some trains even had dining cars. As the locomotive pulled away from the coast and plunged deep into the American heartland, the true psychological disorientation began. For days, they stared out the windows at a landscape that defied belief. It was a continuous panorama of impossible abundance. Vast, immaculate farms stretched to the horizon, dotted with sturdy barns and handsome farmhouses. Highways were thick with cars and trucks. Towns and cities passed by, each one looking more prosperous and peaceful than the last. There were no checkpoints, no signs of military occupation, no visible strain. This wasn't a country at war. This was a country going about its business, and the war was merely its business. The first meal served on American soil was a profound, almost spiritual shock. At a processing center in Virginia, thousands of weary, grimy German POWs were led into a cavernous mess hall. They shuffled in, expecting the standard prisoner's fare, a lump of stale bread, a bowl of thin, watery soup. It was what they would have given their own prisoners. It was what their own families were eating back home in Germany if they were lucky. The men filed down a cafeteria line, a concept foreign to many of them, and held out their metal trays. What was slopped onto them felt like a hallucination. First, a scoop of scrambled eggs, real eggs, yellow and fluffy. Then came strips of bacon, sizzling and fragrant. There were slices of soft, white bread, a luxury not seen in Germany for years, accompanied by a pat of real butter and a small jar of marmalade. To wash it down, there was a steaming mug of coffee, and next to the pot was a bowl piled high with an astonishing substance, pure, white, granulated sugar. Men stared at their trays, then at each other. Some hesitated, believing it was a trick, a final, cruel joke before the starvation began. Others, driven by gnawing hunger, began to eat mechanically, their minds struggling to process the sensory input. The taste of the sweet coffee, the salty bacon, the richness of the butter, it was an assault of flavor and plenty. An officer from the 10th Panzer Division would later write in his diary, "I have not eaten such a breakfast in 5 years, not even in Paris on leave. The guards eat this every day. Every day, I do not understand. How can they feed us, the enemy, better than we feed our own frontline soldiers?" It was more than a meal. It was a statement of power. It communicated, with zero ambiguity, that America could afford to feed its enemies like kings, and it did not even notice the expense. This simple breakfast did more to undermine German morale than a week of Allied bombing. It was the first salvo in a campaign of psychological warfare waged with bread and butter. Their indoctrination into the American way of life continued with a bewildering array of small, everyday luxuries that, to them, represented unimaginable wealth. One of the most potent symbols was a simple, dark, bubbly liquid, Coca-Cola. It was everywhere. In the camp canteens, known as post-exchanges or PXs, it was sold for a nickel a bottle. The POWs, who could earn scrip by working on local farms or in non-war-related industries, discovered the sweet, caffeinated drink with an almost religious fervor. For men raised in an era of strict rationing and ersatz substitutes, the very idea of a purely recreational beverage, produced on an industrial scale and available cheaply to everyone, including prisoners, was mind-altering. It was a taste of a world free from want. The PX itself was a temple of consumerism that left them speechless. Lined with shelves, it offered items that were either non-existent or reserved for the highest Nazi Party officials back home. There were cigarettes of multiple brands, Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield. There were chocolates and candy bars from Hershey's and Mars. They could buy toothpaste, shaving cream, razor blades, and slick hair pomade. They could purchase writing paper, pens, and books. The sheer variety was astounding. This wasn't a special store for prisoners. This was just a small sample of what any American civilian could buy at any corner store. It was the casualness of the abundance that was so devastating. Back in Germany, propaganda posters urged citizens to sacrifice everything for the war effort. Wheels must roll for victory. But here, in the heart of the enemy nation, wheels were rolling to deliver chewing gum and ice cream to prison camps. This stark contrast created a cognitive dissonance that was impossible to reconcile with their Nazi ideology. How could a nation so decadent and materialistic also be so powerful? The propaganda had insisted that such comforts made a nation weak. But here was the proof. sitting on the shelves of a humble camp store, that America's comfort and its power were two sides of the same coin. The foundation of their belief system was cracking under the weight of Hershey bars and Coca-Cola. The train journey westward was an education in industrial and agricultural might that no German general staff briefing could have ever conveyed. As the miles unspooled, the prisoners saw a country not just untouched by war, but thriving because of it. The most staggering sights were the factories. They would pass through industrial cities like Pittsburgh or Gary, and the sky would be hazy with the smoke of production. But this was not the smoke of burning cities. It was the smoke of creation. For miles, they would see colossal factory complexes, their windows blazing with light 24 hours a day. Out of these factories, they saw the instruments of their own destruction being born. On parallel railway lines, endless flat cars rolled past, laden with brand-new Sherman tanks, olive drab and identical as far as the eye could see. They weren't being rushed to a desperate front. They were being transported from the factory to the port, a seemingly inexhaustible river of steel. Then came the planes. They saw vast airfields where hundreds of B-17 bombers and P-51 fighters sat gleaming in the sun, wingtip to wingtip. They looked like silver toys, waiting to be shipped to Europe to rain death upon the fatherland. A Luftwaffe pilot, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, watched this display in stunned silence. He had been taught that Allied aircraft production was struggling, that their losses were unsustainable. What he saw from his train window was not a nation struggling. It was a nation that produced war machines with the same casual efficiency that it produced automobiles. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Germany could never match this. For every Messerschmitt his country painstakingly built in a hidden, bombed-out factory, America was rolling a dozen fighters off an assembly line in a place that didn't even know a war was on. The scale was inhuman, astronomical. It wasn't warfare. It was an industrial algorithm, and they were on the losing side of the equation. One of the most profound shocks to the German psyche was the sight of American women. The Nazi ideology had a very specific and rigid role for women: kinder, Kuch, Kirch, children, kitchen, church. A woman's place was in the home, producing racially pure children for the Reich and supporting her husband. Propaganda glorified the robust, maternal German woman, her hair in braids, dedicated to domestic life. To see women in the public sphere, working in factories or driving cars, was seen as a sign of social decay, a perversion of the natural order. As the POWs were transported across the country or put to work on farms and in canneries, they were confronted with a reality that shattered this dogma. They saw women everywhere, performing jobs they considered exclusively male. Women in overalls operated heavy machinery in factories. Women drove tractors on farms, their hands greasy, their faces smudged with dirt. They drove trucks, delivered mail, and worked as clerks and secretaries. They were not the demure, subservient figures of Nazi fantasy. They were confident, independent, and visibly integral to the American war machine. A captured U-boat crewman, put to work in a Minnesota pea cannery, found himself working alongside local women. He was astonished by their candor and their easygoing familiarity. They joked with him, shared their lunches, and spoke of their husbands and brothers overseas with a determined pride that he found deeply unsettling. These were not the decadent and immoral women from Goebbels's caricatures. They were strong, capable, and fiercely patriotic. The realization dawned on him and his comrades. America was not fighting with one hand tied behind its back. It was fighting with its full population mobilized. Every woman working in a factory freed up a man to be a soldier. This quiet, unassuming female workforce was a force multiplier on an epic scale, a hidden reserve of industrial strength that Germany, with its restrictive ideology, could never hope to match. It was another crack in the fortress of their beliefs. The agricultural landscape of America was another front in this undeclared psychological war. The German soldiers, many of them from rural backgrounds, understood land, crops, and livestock. They knew the backbreaking labor and the constant struggle against scarcity that defined European farming. The concept of the blood and soil, Blut und Boden, was central to Nazi ideology, glorifying the German peasant as the racial and spiritual backbone of the nation. Yet their own agricultural system, for all its romanticization, was inefficient and increasingly strained by the demands of war. What they saw from their train windows and later experienced firsthand working on American farms was a revelation. The sheer scale was the first shock. Farms were not small, fragmented plots worked by entire families with hand tools and draft animals. They were vast, sprawling enterprises that stretched for thousands of acres. The second shock was the level of mechanization. A single American farmer, using a gleaming John Deere tractor, could cultivate more land in a day than a German family could in a week. They saw mechanical harvesters, threshers, and balers, machines that were rare or non-existent back home. This wasn't farming as they knew it. This was industrial agriculture. The abundance it produced was staggering. They saw cornfields that seemed to stretch to the ends of the earth, cattle herds that numbered in the thousands, and orchards heavy with fruit. When assigned to work on these farms, they were often invited to eat with the farmer's family. At the dinner table, they were confronted with mountains of food: roast beef, chicken, potatoes, corn on the cob, fresh milk, and pies. It was a daily feast that would have been fit for a general in the Wehrmacht. One prisoner, after a day of work on a farm in Wisconsin, wrote a letter home which was later read by a camp censor. He described the farmer's house with its electricity and indoor plumbing. He described the family car. He described the food. And then he wrote the sentence that captured the creeping despair. "These people are not hungry. They do not know there is a war. How can we ever defeat a country like this?" Beyond the material wealth, it was the American political and social system that proved to be one of the most disorienting discoveries. Raised in a totalitarian state where the will of the Führer was absolute and dissent was met with death, the concepts of democracy, free speech, and individual liberty were alien. They had been taught that democracy was chaotic and inefficient, a system that bred weakness and division. In the POW camps, they were given their first, carefully managed taste of it. The Americans, as part of a secret re-education program, allowed the prisoners to elect their own camp spokesmen. They were permitted to publish their own camp newspapers, albeit under the watchful eye of American censors. Within these papers, surprisingly lively debates often broke out. Anti-Nazi prisoners, emboldened by their new environment, would write articles criticizing the Reich, which would be met with furious rebuttals from loyal Nazi hardliners in the next issue. For the American camp commanders, this was a calculated risk. For the German prisoners, it was a spectacle. They were witnessing open disagreement in print, a cardinal sin in Nazi Germany. They saw that men could hold opposing views and argue fiercely without one side ending up in a concentration camp. The guards, too, were a source of confusion. The prisoners saw them openly complaining about their commanding officers, grumbling about the food, and even making jokes at the expense of President Roosevelt. To a German soldier, such behavior was unthinkable. Criticizing a superior, let alone the head of state, was an act of treason. Yet here it was treated as a normal, harmless part of daily life. This casual freedom was both seductive and frightening. It suggested a society built not on rigid control and terrified obedience, but on a foundation of trust and individual rights. It was a system that seemed, on the surface, to be messy and undisciplined. And yet, this was the system that was producing an avalanche of tanks, planes, and well-fed soldiers that was crushing their supposedly superior, orderly state. The contradiction was maddening, and it forced them to question the very nature of strength and power. The quality of medical care provided to them as prisoners was another powerful and unexpected blow to their morale. In the brutal calculus of total war, prisoners were typically at the bottom of the priority list. A wounded German soldier, captured by Soviets on the Eastern Front, could expect a bullet or, at best, a festering death from neglect in a gulag. Even in their own army, medical supplies were dwindling, and wounded Lancer often received rudimentary care. When German POWs in America fell ill or were brought in with injuries from the battlefield, they were braced for the worst. Instead, they were taken to clean, well-equipped camp hospitals, often staffed with dedicated doctors and nurses. They received treatments and medicines that were becoming scarce even for civilians back in Germany. They were given sulfa drugs to fight eye infection, received expert surgery, and were provided with proper dental care. A German corporal who had lost a leg in Tunisia was fitted with a state-of-the-art prosthetic leg at a hospital in Virginia, a piece of medical technology far superior to what he could have hoped for at home. He was given physical therapy and treated with a degree of professionalism and compassion that he found utterly bewildering. He was the enemy, a soldier of a regime that preached the extermination of its foes, and yet these Americans were diligently working to restore his health and mobility. This wasn't just about adhering to the Geneva Convention. It was another effortless display of overwhelming capacity. America had so many resources, so many doctors, so much medicine, that it could afford to lavish first-class care on its captured enemies without impacting the care of its own troops. For the prisoners, this created a complex emotional response. There was gratitude, but it was mixed with a deep sense of shame and despair. It underscored the vast chasm between the humane ideals the Americans professed and the brutal, merciless ideology they themselves had served. The message was clear: we will defeat you, but we will not become you. The sounds of America were a constant, subliminal reminder of the nation's boundless energy and wealth. In Germany, the dominant sounds of the war were the mournful wail of air raid sirens and the terrifying thunder of Allied bombs. The skies were a place of dread. In the POW camps of rural America, the sky was filled with a different kind of sound. Day after day, they would hear the drone of aircraft, but it wasn't the sound of combat. It was the sound of training. Formations of B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses would rumble overhead on practice runs, their engines a steady, confident roar. Young American pilots honed their skills in the skies above Texas and Arizona, far from any danger, in planes fresh from the factory. For the captured Luftwaffe pilots among the POWs, this was a particularly bitter pill to swallow. They had fought desperately in the skies over Europe, outnumbered and low on fuel, watching their comrades fall one by one. Here, their enemy was minting new pilots and new bombers on an industrial scale. The sounds from the ground were just as telling. In the camps, prisoners were often allowed to have radios. They would tune in to American stations, and what they heard was not grim martial music or frantic propaganda speeches. They heard jazz and swing music, the very degenerate sounds that the Nazi regime had banned. They heard boisterous commercials for products like soap, breakfast cereal, and automobiles, a torrent of advertisements for a consumer paradise that was apparently still going strong, war or no war. They heard radio dramas, comedies, and quiz shows where contestants won refrigerators and washing machines. It painted a picture of a society so rich and so secure that it could afford to be distracted, entertained, and lighthearted, even in the midst of a global conflict. The contrast with the radio broadcasts from home, which were censored, filled with news of defeats disguised as tactical withdrawals, and punctuated by calls for more sacrifice, was stark and depressing. The very airwaves seemed to mock them, broadcasting the enemy's confidence and prosperity directly into their barracks. As the initial shock of America's material wealth began to settle, a deeper, more troubling realization started to sink in. It was the scale of the country's potential. What they were seeing was not a nation at its absolute limit, straining every sinew to fight the war. It was a nation that seemed to be waging a world war part-time. This was most evident when they had contact with the civilians who guarded them or employed them for labor. The GIs guarding the camps were often older men, or those classified as 4F, unfit for combat duty. They were the nation's second or third string. The real fighting men, the prime of American youth, were overseas in Europe and the Pacific, yet even these non-combat guards were well-fed, well-equipped, and possessed a casual confidence that unnerved the prisoners. The farmers and factory owners who contracted POW labor were another enigma. They would drive up to the camps in their personal cars that were often only a few years old, to pick up their workers for the day. They complained about rationing, but to the Germans, who were used to genuine privation, their complaints seemed absurd. An American might grumble about the limit on gasoline or sugar, but he still had gasoline and sugar, things that were distant memories for the average German civilian. A high-ranking German officer, a veteran of Stalingrad, observed this phenomenon with a strategist's eye. He saw the vast civilian economy churning alongside the war economy. He saw millions of men and women who were not yet in uniform, millions of factories not yet converted to war product. On, he wrote a secret report intended to be smuggled back to Germany that was intercepted by camp authorities. In it, he concluded, "We are not fighting the United States. We are fighting only a fraction of its power. The full weight of its industrial and military might has not even been brought to bear yet. To continue this war is national suicide." He had understood the terrifying truth. Germany had gambled everything, thrown its entire national being into the conflict. America, it seemed, was just getting warmed up. The escalation of shock continued as the prisoners were given glimpses into the sheer technological superiority of the American military machine. It wasn't just the quantity of weapons, it was the quality and sophistication. While working near railway lines, they didn't just see Sherman tanks. They began to see newer, more advanced hardware. They saw M10 tank destroyers with their powerful high-velocity cannons. They saw self-propelled artillery pieces and strange-looking amphibious vehicles. Each piece of equipment looked immaculately constructed, a product of advanced mass production techniques that Germany, with its reliance on skilled labor, could not replicate on the same scale. The aircraft were a particular source of awe and dread. They heard stories from newly arrived prisoners, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over France, who spoke with a kind of terrified reverence about the P-51 Mustang. They described a fighter plane that could fly higher, faster, and longer than their best Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. They talked about how the Mustangs could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, systematically sweeping the Luftwaffe from its own skies. To the German pilots in the camps, this was devastating news. The defense of the Reich's airspace had been their sacred duty. To learn that it had been so completely breached by a superior enemy fighter was to learn that the heart of Germany was now defenseless. Then came the rumors and later the confirmation of the B-29 superfortress. Whispers spread through the camps about a new American bomber, a veritable flying fortress that was larger, faster, and could carry a heavier bomb load than anything seen before. They heard it was pressurized, allowing it to fly at altitudes where German flak and fighters were ineffective. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a generational leap in technology. It was a weapon against which they had no defense. The realization was chilling. While Germany had been pouring its resources into wonder weapons like the V-1 and V-2 rockets, weapons of terror with little strategic value, America had been perfecting the tools of systematic industrial-scale destruction. They were being outthought, out-engineered, and outproduced at every turn. Nothing prepared them for the Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalog. In some camps, these mail-order wish books were available in the libraries or were brought in by civilian employers. For the German POWs, thumbing through its hundreds of pages was like peering into an alternate dimension of consumerist fantasy. It was a document more powerful than any propaganda leaflet. The catalog was a meticulously illustrated Bible of American abundance. It contained everything. There were pages and pages of fashionable clothing for men, women, and children in a dizzying array of styles and colors. There were sturdy work boots and elegant dress shoes. There were sections for furniture, offering plush sofas, polished dining room sets, and comfortable beds. The kitchenware section was a universe of its own, with electric mixers, pressure cookers, and gleaming sets of pots and pans. They saw tools for every conceivable trade, from carpentry to plumbing. They saw hunting rifles, fishing rods, and baseball gloves. They saw toys for children, electric trains, elaborate dolls, and shiny bicycles. Each item was clearly priced, available to any average person with a mailing address. A German NCO, who had been a skilled machinist before the war, spent an entire evening staring at the section on power tools. He saw electric drills, lathes, and table saws for home workshops that were better than some of the equipment he had used in his factory in Essen. The prices, when he roughly converted them from dollars to Reichsmarks, were shockingly low. The idea that an ordinary American worker could simply order these things from a book and have them delivered to his house was beyond comprehension. The catalog served as irrefutable, tangible proof that the American civilian standard of living was higher than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just that America was winning the war. Its citizens were living better during the war than Germans had lived before it even began. This book, with its colorful pictures of washing machines and wristwatches, was a death sentence for the Nazi ideology of sacrifice and austerity. Letters from home became a source of profound psychological torment. Mail was censor. By both German and American authorities, but the prisoners learned to read between the lines. The letters, written on flimsy, poor-quality paper, painted a grim and deteriorating picture of life in the Third Reich. Their wives and mothers wrote of the constant, terrifying air raids. They described huddling in damp cellars, listening to the city above them being pounded into rubble. They mentioned neighbors who were no longer with us. They spoke of the relentless rationing, the endless queues for a few potatoes or a loaf of coarse, sawdust-filled bread. Meat was a distant memory. Coffee was made from roasted acorns. Their children were thin and pale, their growth stunted by malnutrition. The tone of the letters shifted over time. The early, defiant patriotism faded, replaced by a weary, desperate plea for the war to end. "We are all so tired," one wife wrote. "Little Klaus asks every day when you are coming home. I don't know what to tell him anymore." The prisoners would read these heartbreaking dispatches in their barracks in places like Alabama or Oklahoma, often after having eaten a hearty meal of pork chops and apple pie in the camp mess hall. The guilt was crushing. They were safe, well-fed, and living in relative comfort, while their families were starving and cowering in ruins. They were the enemy, yet they were better off than their own loved ones. This created a bitter, disorienting paradox. Who was really the prisoner? Them behind barbed wire in a land of plenty, or their families trapped in the collapsing prison of the Third Reich? The stark contrast between their own condition and the suffering of their families shattered any remaining illusions about the war. It was no longer an abstract geopolitical struggle. It was a clear and personal catastrophe. They were losing, and their families were paying the highest price. The propaganda about a glorious victory now seemed like a sick, cruel joke. The American approach to information and news was another weapon in their psychological re-education. In Germany, all media was state-controlled. The news was what Goebbels said it was. Victories were exaggerated, defeats were ignored or spun as strategic repositioning. The German people were kept in a carefully constructed bubble of misinformation. In the POW camps, the prisoners were exposed to a radically different information environment. They were given access to American newspapers and magazines like Life and Time. At first, the Nazi loyalists among them dismissed it all as enemy propaganda. But they soon noticed something strange. The news wasn't uniformly positive. The papers reported on American military setbacks. They published casualty lists. They contained articles critical of the government's strategy and even of President Roosevelt himself. There were political cartoons mocking Allied leaders. This was incomprehensible. A media that openly criticized its own side during a war? It seemed like madness, a sign of the very weakness they had been taught to expect from democracy. Yet over time, a different understanding began to emerge. They realized that this open reporting, this willingness to admit failure, actually created a sense of credibility. When these same newspapers reported a major Allied victory, like the landings in Normandy or the breakout at St. Lo, the prisoners were more inclined to believe it. They had seen the bad news, so the good news must also be true. This was a far more sophisticated form of persuasion than the clumsy, absolute lies of their own propaganda ministry. The most effective tool was the camp newspaper Der Ruf, The Call, which was written and edited by anti-Nazi German prisoners under American supervision. It published detailed, factual accounts of the war's progress, including maps showing the relentless advance of Allied armies from the west and the Soviet steamroller in the east. For the first time, many prisoners saw the true, desperate strategic situation of the Reich laid out in black and white. The bubble was burst. The truth, they discovered, was a far more powerful weapon than any lie. The concept of American race relations presented a complex and often contradictory puzzle for the German prisoners. Nazi ideology was built on a foundation of rigid racial hierarchy, with the Aryan race at the pinnacle and everyone else, particularly Jews, Slavs, and black people, deemed inferior. Propaganda had relentlessly portrayed America as a mongrel nation, weakened and corrupted by its racial mixing. They arrived expecting to see evidence of this chaos and decay. What they found was far more complicated. They witnessed firsthand the system of racial segregation in the American South. They saw separate facilities for black and white Americans, separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms, separate sections on buses. This, in a perverse way, seemed to confirm their own beliefs in racial separation. Some of the more ardent Nazis felt a sense of vindicat. "Ian, you see," one might say to another, "they know the races must be kept apart. They are not so different from us." But this shallow confirmation was quickly undermined by other, more powerful observations. The American military, while still segregated, was utilizing black soldiers on a massive scale. They saw entire regiments of African American soldiers, in uniform, armed and trained, contributing to the war effort. This directly contradicted the Nazi myth that black people were incapable of being effective soldiers. More profoundly, in the northern and western states, the system was different. They saw black and white people working side by side in some factories or shopping in the same stores. And then there was the propaganda aimed at them. The Americans made a point of highlighting the contributions of all Americans to the war. They were shown films about famous black Americans like the boxer Joe Louis, who had famously defeated the German champion Max Schmeling, and the scientist George Washington Carver. The message, though imperfectly practiced by the Americans themselves, was one of pluralism, that people of different backgrounds could unite for a common cause. This slowly eroded the simplistic, monolithic racial theories of Nazism. It showed them that a nation's strength might not come from its racial purity, but from its ability to draw on the talents of all its people. As the war in Europe neared its conclusion, a new type of prisoner began to arrive in the camps. These were no longer the hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, captured in 1943. These were the very young and the very old, the last dregs of German manpower swept up in the final, desperate battles of 1944 and 1945. They were teenage boys from the Hitler Youth and weary old men from the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. Their arrival sent a shockwave through the established POW community. The veterans who had been in America for years looked at these new arrivals with a mixture of pity and horror. The boys were barely 16, their faces still soft with youth, yet their eyes held the haunted look of old men. They were filled with a fanatical, desperate belief in final victory, spouting slogans about secret weapons that would turn the tide. They spoke of a Germany that the long-term prisoners no longer recognized. They described a nation of rubble, where civilians spent more time in bomb shelters than in their own homes. They talked about starvation, about the collapse of civil order, and about the brutal SS squads that would hang anyone suspected of defeatism. The older men were even more tragic. They were grandfathers, shopkeepers, and farmers in their 50s and 60s, who had been given a Panzerfaust and a cheap uniform and thrown into the path of advancing Sherman tanks. They were broken, exhausted men who knew the war was lost but had fought on out of fear or a misplaced sense of duty. Their stories confirmed the worst fears of the prisoners in America. The letters from home had painted a grim picture, but the first-hand accounts from these new arrivals were a vision of the apocalypse. The Reich was not just losing, it was consuming itself. It was sacrificing its children and its old men in a meaningless, nihilistic final stand. For many of the long-term POWs, this was the final, undeniable proof that the regime they had served was not just incompetent, but murderously insane. Any lingering loyalty to the Führer evaporated in the face of these walking ghosts from their ruined homeland. The turning point for many prisoners was not a single event, but a slow, dawning comprehension of the industrial equation of the war. It was a realization that went beyond simply seeing tanks on a train. It was an understanding of the system that produced those tanks. Some prisoners with engineering or manufacturing backgrounds were put to work in non-military industries like sawmills, furniture factories, or food processing plants. Here, they got an inside look at American production methods. They were stunned by the principles of Taylorism and Fordism in action. They saw assembly lines, standardization of parts, and an obsession with efficiency that surpassed anything they had witnessed in Germany. German industry, for all its technical prowess, still relied heavily on a master-apprentice model, with highly skilled craftsmen meticulously building complex machinery. It produced superb individual products, like the Tiger tank, but it could not produce them in overwhelming numbers. America, they saw, had taken a different path. It had de-skilled the manufacturing process. A complex task was broken down into dozens of simple, repetitive actions that could be performed by a worker with only a few hours of training. This was the secret to its incredible output. This was how women who had been housewives a month earlier could now be building the intricate wiring harnesses of a B-24 bomber. A former foreman from a Messerschmitt plant watched a cannery assembly line in Minnesota with a kind of professional horror and admiration. He saw how every movement was optimized, how there was no wasted energy, no unnecessary steps. The cans flowed in a relentless, perfectly synchronized river. He understood that this same philosophy applied to building airplanes and ships was unstoppable. "We are not fighting an army," he told a fellow prisoner. "We are fighting a factory, and the factory never sleeps." This was the moment of true intellectual surrender. They could not outfight the American soldier because they could never outproduce the American worker. The war had been won not on the battlefields of Normandy, but on the assembly lines of Detroit. The emotional breakdown often came quietly, in the solitude of a bunk bed after lights out. It was the moment when the weight of all the accumulated evidence became too heavy to bear. The food, the factories, the movies, the letters from home, it all coalesced into a single, crushing truth. They had been lied to about everything. The America they were living in was not the America of Goebbels' speeches. The Germany their families were dying in was not the glorious Reich of their Führer's promises. The entire foundation of their world was built on lies, and now it had crumbled, leaving them in a psychological freefall. A U-boat sailor, a man who had been a true believer, part of the elite Kriegsmarine, described his breaking point. He had received a letter from his sister in Dresden. She described the firebombing in February 1945. She wrote not with anger at the enemy, but with a hollow, soul-shattering despair. She described the unspeakable horror, the melted asphalt in the streets, the bodies of children fused together. That night, lying in his quiet barracks in Arizona, listening to the gentle hum of the desert wind, he finally allowed himself to weep. He wept for his family, for his city, for his country. But he also wept for himself, for his own stupidity, his own blindness. He had proudly served a regime that had led his people into this inferno. He had believed in the Führer, in the superiority of his race, in the justice of his cause. And it had all led to this. his family incinerated, his country in ruins, and he himself a prisoner, being kept safe and well-fed by the very people he had been sent to destroy. The sense of betrayal was absolute. It was not the Americans who had defeated him. It was his own leaders. They had not only lost the war, they had stolen his faith, his identity, and his honor. All that was left was a vast, empty expanse of shame and disillusionment. The comparison between their own ruined country and the pristine landscape of America became a source of constant, painful reflection. Every symbol of American peace and prosperity was a mirror reflecting Germany's devastation. Driving in a truck through a small town in Georgia, a prisoner would see children playing on manicured lawns in front of neat, white picket-fenced houses. He would immediately be struck by the image of children in Hamburg, playing in the rubble of bombed-out apartment buildings, using craters as their playgrounds. He would see a church, its steeple clean and white against a blue sky, and he would remember the hollowed-out shell of the Cologne Cathedral, its famous spires miraculously intact but surrounded by a sea of destruction. He would see a farmer calmly plowing a field and think of the fields of Ukraine and Belarus, poisoned by war, littered with the burnt-out hulks of tanks, and sown with landmines. The contrast was a form of psychological torture. It wasn't just that America was undamaged. It was that its normalcy seemed to mock Germany's suffering. The prisoners started to feel a profound sense of disconnection from their own past. The Germany they had left behind, a place of parades, torchlight rallies, and confident power, no longer existed. The letters from home confirmed it. The stories from new prisoners proved it. It had been replaced by a nightmarish landscape of death and ruin. They were exiles, not just from their country, but from their own memories. An artillery officer kept a small, worn photograph of his family, taken in a park in Berlin in 1938. In the picture, they are smiling, well-dressed, sitting on a bench surrounded by flowers. He looked at that picture, and then he looked out the window of his barracks at the peaceful Wisconsin countryside. He realized that the park in the photograph was likely a crater now. The world in that picture was gone forever, as lost and irretrievable as Atlantis. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical blow, that the men who had sent him to war were the ones who had destroyed it. With the collapse of their faith in the Reich's military and industrial power came the collapse of their faith in its leadership. The figure of Adolf Hitler, once a godlike Führer who could do no wrong, was now subject to a bitter and cynical reevaluation. In the early days of their captivity, many prisoners had maintained a fierce loyalty to Hitler. They would argue with anti-Nazis in the barracks, insisting that the Führer had a secret plan, that new weapons would turn the tide, that the reverses were only temporary. They clung to the myth of his genius. But as the evidence of America's power mounted and the news from the front grew ever more grim, the myth began to unravel. They started to ask forbidden questions. Why had Hitler declared war on the United States, a country with such bottomless resources? Why had he invaded the Soviet Union, opening up a catastrophic two-front war? Why had he promoted incompetent party cronies over brilliant professional generals? The stories from newly captured soldiers painted a picture not of a brilliant strategist, but of a delusional madman, locked in his bunker, pushing around imaginary armies on a map while Germany burned. They heard of his increasingly erratic decisions, his furious tirades, his refusal to countenance any retreat. The man they had worshipped as the savior of Germany was now revealed as its destroyer. This disillusionment was a deeply personal and painful process. For many, their entire identity had been wrapped up in their loyalty to the Führer and the National Socialist cause. To admit that Hitler was a failure was to admit that their own sacrifices and the deaths of their friends and comrades had been for nothing. It meant that they had been fools, duped by a charismatic charlatan. The anger and resentment began to turn inward from the American captors to their own leaders. "He betrayed us," one prisoner scrawled on the wall of his barrack. "He promised us a 1,000-year Reich, and he gave us a mountain of corpses." The God had failed, and in the ruins of their faith, a terrible clarity began to emerge. As the war entered its final, bloody days in the spring of 1945, the atmosphere in the camps grew thick with tension and uncertainty. The prisoners gathered around radios, listening to the BBC and American news broadcasts, tracking the final Götterdämmerung of the Third Reich. They heard of the Rhine being crossed, of the Ruhr pocket being encircled, of the Soviets storming the suburbs of Berlin. The news they had long dreaded and secretly hoped for was finally arriving. For the hardline Nazis, it was a time of despair and denial. Some clung to the fantasy that the Western Allies would join forces with the remnants of the Wehrmacht to fight the advancing Bolsheviks. Others became more belligerent, threatening the anti-Nazi prisoners and vowing to continue the fight even after the war was over. But for the vast majority, the news brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief that the senseless slaughter was finally ending, that their families might soon be safe from the bombing. There was anxiety about what would happen to them now. Would they be treated as criminals? When would they be allowed to go home? And what kind of home would they be returning to? Then in early May, the news crackled over the radio. Berlin had fallen. The Führer was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. A strange quiet fell over the camps. There were no celebrations, no riots. It was the quiet of a deep, collective exhaustion. The war was over. For 6 long years, it had consumed their lives, dictated their every action, and filled their minds. And now it was just finished. A veteran of the Sixth Army, a survivor of Stalingrad who had been a prisoner for over 2 years, simply sat on his bunk and stared at the floor for hours. The struggle that had defined his entire adult life was gone. The cause he had nearly died for had been utterly defeated and discredited. He was alive, he was safe, but he felt a profound and terrifying emptiness. He was no longer a soldier of the German Reich. He was just a man in a prison camp, thousands of miles from a home that no longer existed, facing a future that was a complete and terrifying blank. The ultimate revelation, the shock that dwarfed all others, was yet to come. It was a moral bombshell that would incinerate any last vestiges of pride or justification they might have held for their service. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, the American camp authorities began a systematic and deliberate program of confrontation. They had a new objective, not just to demilitarize the prisoners, but to denazify them. They marched the prisoners into the camp theaters, the same places where they had once watched Hollywood comedies in bewilderment. But the films they were shown now were not fantasies. They were stark, unblinking, black-and-white documentaries. They were newsreels, filmed by Allied combat cameramen who had accompanied the troops liberating the concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The lights went down, and the horror began. The prisoners stared in stunned, nauseated silence at images their minds could barely process. They saw skeletal, walking corpses in striped pajamas, their eyes hollowed out by starvation and despair. They saw the bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated, naked bodies into mass graves. They saw the crematoria, the piles of human hair, the thousands of pairs of shoes taken from the dead. They saw the gas chambers. The images were relentless, irrefutable, and soul-destroying. For years, they had heard rumors. They had been told it was all enemy propaganda, vicious lies designed to slander the good name of Germany. But this was not propaganda. This was film. This was evidence. This was the truth in all its unthinkable depravity. A collective groan of revulsion and disbelief went through the audience. Men who had stormed machine gun nests and endured artillery barrages without flinching now openly wept. Others vomited where they sat. Many simply stared, their faces masks of pale, frozen horror. They had thought they were fighting a war for their country. They now understood they had been the tools of a mass murder machine, the enforcers for a regime of unprecedented evil. The screening of the concentration camp films marked the absolute climax of their psychological journey. It was the point of no return. After seeing those images, nothing could ever be the same. The moral framework of their world did not just crack, it was pulverized into dust. In the days and weeks that followed, a profound and heavy silence descended upon the camps. The usual barracks chatter, the arguments, the card games, it all ceased. Men walked around like ghosts, lost in their own private hells of guilt and shame. The hardline Nazis were the most visibly broken. Their entire ideology was predicated on the idea of their own moral and racial superiority. The films had exposed this as a grotesque lie. Their new order was not a glorious civilization. It was an abattoir. Their leaders were not noble visionaries. They were gangsters and mass murderers. Some tried to deny it, to claim the films were faked, but their protests were feeble and lacked conviction. They had seen the truth, and it had broken them. For the average soldier, the men who had claimed they were just following orders and knew nothing of these atrocities, the revelation was a different kind of torture. It forced a terrible self-examination. What had they known? What had they suspected? What had they chosen to ignore? A Panzer crewman remembered seeing trains packed with people heading east, hearing the rumors and deliberately pushing them out of his mind. "We told ourselves it was not our business," he confessed to a camp chaplain. "We were soldiers, we had a war to fight, but now I see it was our business. We stood by and let it happen. Our hands are not clean." This was the true defeat. It was not the surrender of their armies or the ruin of their cities. It was the surrender of their conscience. They had lost more than a war. They had lost their honor, their claim to decency. They were forced to confront the monstrous truth that the world would have been a better place if they had lost, and lost sooner. The revelation of the Holocaust recontextualized everything they had experienced in America. The kindness, the abundance, the democratic principles, it all took on a new meaning. Before, it had been a source of confusion and envy, a display of the enemy's material strength. Now it appeared as a symbol of their moral strength. They finally understood what the war had truly been about. It wasn't a struggle for territory or resources, as they had been told. It was a clash of fundamental values. It was a war between a civilization that produced Hollywood movies, Coca-Cola and Sears catalogs, and an ideology that produced Auschwitz. The casual decency of their American guards, which had once perplexed them, now seemed heroic. The fact that the Americans treated them, the soldiers of this monstrous regime, with humanity and according to the rules of war was a powerful testament to the ideals their enemies professed. It was a form of moral jiu-jitsu. The Americans were defeating Nazism not only with bombs and bullets, but by demonstrating a superior way of life, a more humane code of conduct. A German infantry captain who had once been a university professor of philosophy gathered a group of younger prisoners around him. "For years, we were taught that democracy was weak and compassion was a flaw," he told them. "We were taught that only ruthlessness and iron will could create a strong nation. Look where it has led us. To ruin and eternal shame. And look at our enemies. Their strength comes not from their harshness, but from their freedom. Their power comes from their prosperity. We worship death. They celebrate life. We have seen both, and now we must choose which path Germany will follow after this." The re-education program was no longer something to be endured. For many, it became a lifeline, a chance to understand how their country had gone so wrong and how it might one day be redeemed. The American response to Germany's surrender was the final, confounding lesson in the nature of their enemy. The prisoners braced themselves for retribution. They expected the guards' attitudes to harden, for rations to be cut, for privileges to be revoked. They were, after all, the defeated remnants of an army that had caused the deaths of millions, including hundreds of thousands of Americans. They deserved punishment, but the punishment never came. The routine of camp life continued almost unchanged. The food remained plentiful, the work details continued, the movies were still shown. The guards, if anything, seemed to display a kind of weary sympathy. There was no gloating, no "we told you so." There was only a quiet, business-like focus on the next phase, repatriation. This lack of vengefulness was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. It defied the logic of war as they understood it. The Nazi doctrine was clear. To the victor belongs the spoils, and to the vanquished, utter humiliation and destruction. They had seen how their own armies behaved in Poland and Russia. Had they won, their enemies would have been enslaved or exterminated. Yet the Americans, in their moment of absolute triumph, showed restraint. This was not weakness. The prisoners knew, better than anyone, the terrifying power America could unleash if it chose to. This was a different kind of strength, a moral confidence so profound that it did not require cruelty to assert itself. It was the confidence of a nation that had won so completely, so utterly, that it could afford to be magnanimous. It was the final, crushing demonstration of superiority. It told the German prisoners that they had not just been outfought and outproduced. They had been outclassed. They had been defeated by a better army from a better country built on better ideas. It was a lesson they would never forget. In the aftermath of the Holocaust revelations, the dynamic within the camps shifted dramatically. The authority of the die-hard Nazi prisoners, who had often used intimidation and peer pressure to enforce loyalty to the Reich, completely evaporated. They were now seen as pariahs, the deluded followers of a criminal cult. Their threats were empty, their ideology a disgrace. In their place, the anti-Nazi and democratically minded prisoners rose to prominence. Men who had previously kept their opinions to themselves for fear of reprisal now spoke openly. They became the new leaders, organizing discussion groups, educational seminars, and forums to debate the future of Germany. With the active encouragement of the American camp administration, a genuine democratic culture began to blossom behind the barbed wire. The camp newspapers became vibrant platforms for political discourse. Prisoners wrote passionate articles denouncing militarism and totalitarianism, and advocating for a new, peaceful, democratic Germany integrated with the West. They translated articles from American newspapers about the plans for the Marshall Plan and the formation of the United Nations. They were, in effect, running a crash course in civics for their fellow inmates. These camps, originally built just to contain enemy soldiers, were transformed into unlikely incubators of democracy. The Americans had realized that these hundreds of thousands of prisoners represented a unique opportunity. They were a captive audience who could be educated and converted. When these men eventually returned home, they would not be bitter, vengeful veterans seeking to start the next war. They would be apostles of a new way of thinking, carrying the seeds of democracy back to the fertile ground of a defeated and disillusioned Germany. It was a brilliant, far-sighted strategy, turning the liabilities of a massive prisoner population into a strategic asset for the post-war reconstruction of Europe. The final months of their captivity were a period of intense transformation. The men who had arrived in America as arrogant soldiers of the master race were being remade. The psychological journey was now complete. The initial shock of material abundance had given way to an intellectual understanding of industrial power. That, in turn, had been superseded by a moral collapse in the face of the Holocaust, and finally, a political reawakening. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were students in the most immersive and effective political science seminar ever conceived. They learned about the American system of government with its checks and balances. They studied the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They read the works of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. For men raised on the singular, monolithic ideology of Nazism, the idea of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, was a revolutionary concept. They began to see their own history in a new light. They saw how the failures of the Weimar Republic had paved the way for Hitler, and they vowed not to repeat those mistakes. They started to formulate plans for a new Germany, one built on the principles they were now learning. They would be the generation that would have to rebuild their nation from the moral and physical rubble. The experience in America had given them not just a blueprint, but also a sense of hope. They had seen that a different kind of society was possible. They had seen a nation that was strong without being brutal, prosperous without being oppressive, and free without being chaotic. As they packed their meager belongings and prepared for the long journey home, they were profoundly changed men. They were leaving America with something far more valuable than any souvenir from the PX. They were leaving with an idea, and that idea would help shape the future of their country for decades to come. The journey home was the reverse of their arrival, but they were no longer the same men. As their ships crossed the Atlantic, heading east, they were not the confident, indoctrinated soldiers of the Third Reich. They were a humbled, pensive, and strangely enlightened group of survivors. They sailed towards a future that was both terrifying and filled with a fragile new purpose. Landing in a shattered Europe was a brutal shock, even after all they had heard. They disembarked in ports like Le Havre or Bremerhaven and were confronted with the reality they had only seen in newsreels. The destruction was absolute. Entire cities had been leveled, reduced to skeletal ruins and vast fields of rubble. The smell of decay and damp soot hung in the air. The people were gaunt, dressed in rags, their faces etched with trauma and exhaustion. This was the glorious Reich their Führer had promised them. This was the price of their thousand-year fantasy. Seeing it with their own eyes solidified every lesson they had learned in America. The contrast between the broken continent they were returning to and the vibrant, undamaged nation they had just left was the final, irrefutable proof of who had won the war, and why. As they made their way through the ruins, back to whatever was left of their homes and families, they carried their secret knowledge with them. While their fellow Germans were mired in shame, denial, and a struggle for basic survival, these returning POWs had a unique perspective. They had seen the other side. They had lived inside the belly of the beast and discovered it was not a beast at all. They understood the scale of America's power, the resilience of its democratic ideals, and the fundamental reasons for Germany's catastrophic defeat. They were immune to the stab-in-the-back myths that had poisoned Germany after World War I. They knew Germany had not been betrayed. It had been thoroughly and justly beaten by a superior force. Upon their return, these former prisoners became an invisible but influential force in the reconstruction of West Germany. They did not form a political party or a formal organization, but they shared a common, transformative experience. In their towns and villages, they were a voice of reason and moderation. When old Nazis tried to spread myths about the war or blame others for the defeat, these men would quietly but firmly contradict them. "I was there," they would say in a tavern or a town meeting. "I was in America. You have no idea what we were up against." They would describe the endless fields of corn, the factories that never stopped, the people who did not hate them. Their first-hand accounts were more powerful than any Allied propaganda. They could not be dismissed as the lies of the enemy because they came from men who had worn the same uniform and fought in the same trenches. They became staunch supporters of Konrad Adenauer's new West German government and its policy of firm alignment with the United States and the Western Allies. While some Germans resented the American occupation, these men understood it was not an act of vengeance, but a necessary step to rebuild their country and protect it from the new threat of Soviet communism. They had seen what America was capable of, and they wanted its power as an ally, not an enemy. Many went on to become successful businessmen, community leaders, and politicians, helping to build the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Their time in the American POW camps had, paradoxically, prepared them for this task. They had learned about American production methods, and more importantly, they had absorbed the optimistic, pragmatic, can-do spirit of the country. They were, in a strange and unintended way, the most successful product of an American re-education program ever conceived. For many of these men, the connection to America lasted a lifetime. Decades after the war, some would subscribe to American magazines or correspond with the families of the farmers they had worked for. A few even chose to emigrate to the United States, the country that had been their prison but had also become their ideal. Many more organized are. Unions, not of their old army units, but of their fellow POWs from Camp Camo or Camp Shelby or Camp Hearn. They would gather as old men, their hair white and their bodies frail, and they would reminisce. But they did not speak of battles or military glory. They spoke of the first time they tasted ice cream, of the kindness of a farmer's wife in Minnesota, of the shock of seeing a supermarket piled high with food. They spoke of the day they saw the films from the concentration camps and how it had changed them forever. One former prisoner who became a successful engineer brought his grandson to the United States in the 1980s. He took him to a shopping mall. He stood with the boy in the vast, glittering atrium, surrounded by the sights and sounds of American consumerism. The boy was excited, eager to go to the toy store. The old man just stood there, a quiet, wistful look on his face. "This," he told his grandson, "this is the weapon they used to defeat us, and we never even knew we were in a battle." He understood that America's greatest strength was not in its bombs or its tanks, but in its ability to create a world so desirable, so full of promise and plenty, that it made the dark, nihilistic ideologies of its enemies simply collapse under the weight of their own inadequacy. It was a victory won not by conquering a people, but by changing their minds. Looking back, this chapter of the Second World War stands as one of the most unusual and effective instances of psychological warfare ever conducted. It was a war won without firing a shot, waged on the battleground of the human mind. The United States, through a combination of deliberate policy and sheer cultural happenstance, managed to turn over 370,000 enemy prisoners into unwilling admirers of its system. It weaponized its prosperity. Every well-stocked PX, every hearty meal, every new car seen on a highway was a small torpedo aimed at the hull of Nazi ideology. It demonstrated that a society could be both free and powerful, both prosperous and disciplined. It systematically dismantled the lies the prisoners had been told their whole lives, not with counter-propaganda, but with simple, undeniable, everyday reality. The story of the German POWs in America is a testament to the idea that the foundations of a totalitarian state are often more fragile than they appear. The Nazi regime was built on a carefully constructed edifice of lies about its own strength and its enemy's weakness. Once those lies were exposed, once the prisoners were allowed to see the truth with their own eyes, the entire structure came crashing down. It proved that the most powerful force for change is not coercion, but exposure to a better alternative. The men who entered these camps as soldiers of the Third Reich left as something entirely different. They had been defeated, yes, but they had also been liberated from the mental prison of a hateful ideology. They returned to Germany not just as former soldiers, but as accidental missionaries for the very democratic ideals they had been sent to destroy. The title of this story, German POWs Never Expected to Watch Hollywood Movies Behind Barbed Wire, points to the central, surreal irony of their experience. The movies were the perfect metaphor for their entire captivity. On the surface, they were just simple entertainment, a way to pass the time. But in reality, they were a powerful medium of cultural transmission. They presented a vision of American life, idealized, certainly, but rooted in a recognizable truth, that was so potent, so attractive, and so completely at odds with Nazi propaganda that it functioned as a form of brainwashing in reverse. It wasn't a forced indoctrination with political speeches and slogans. It was seduction by celluloid. The prisoners were not told to believe in America. They were shown a world that made them want to believe. The contrast between the glamorous, carefree lives on screen and the grim reality of their family's existence in a bombed-out Germany was a constant, powerful emotional assault. But the movies were just one piece of a much larger mosaic of shock and revelation. Every aspect of their time in the United States, from the food they ate to the political debates they were allowed to have, served the same purpose. It eroded their old certainties and replaced them with a new, complex, and ultimately more truthful understanding of the world. They came to America as enemies, convinced of their own superiority. They left as witnesses to a power, industrial, moral, and cultural, that they knew could not be defeated. The barbed wire fences of their camps did not just keep them in. They created a unique space where an old, broken worldview could die and a new, more hopeful one could be born. The ultimate legacy of this strange wartime episode is a profound lesson in the nature of power. It suggests that true, lasting strength is not just about military might. It is also about the power of ideas, the appeal of a free and prosperous society, and the moral force of humane conduct. In the great ideological struggles of the 20th century, America possessed a secret weapon that its totalitarian adversaries could never replicate. That weapon was America itself. Its open society, its dynamic economy, its culture of optimism and innovation, these were not weaknesses, as its enemies believed. They were the very sources of its indomitable strength. The German prisoners were the first to learn this lesson, but they would not be the last. Throughout the long decades of the Cold War, the same forces would be at play. The appeal of Western consumer goods, rock and roll music, and blue jeans would do as much to undermine the Soviet Empire as any nuclear deterrent. The story of the POWs reminds us that sometimes the most effective way to defeat an enemy ideology is not to destroy its followers, but to win them over. By treating its defeated enemies with a decency they did not expect, and by exposing them to a world they did not know existed, America achieved a victory more complete and more enduring than any that could be won on the battlefield alone. It was a victory not just over an army, but over a state of mind. The men who watched Hollywood movies behind barbed wire became the unlikely proof that even the most hardened beliefs can be changed, not by force, but by the simple, overwhelming evidence of a better way to live. In the end, the experience of the German prisoners of war in America is a story of profound and unexpected transformation. It is a reminder that history is filled with strange ironies and unforeseen consequences. A program designed simply to house enemy combatants became an impromptu university of democracy. A nation fighting a brutal war accidentally discovered that its greatest weapon was its own way of life. The men who arrived as conquerors left as converts, their minds and spirits reshaped by their time in captivity. They had been sent to destroy America, but instead, America had rebuilt them. Their journey from the battlefields of Europe to the farmlands of the American Midwest was more than a geographical displacement. It was a passage from one moral universe to another. They saw the worst of what their own country was capable of, and the best of what their enemy had to offer. This knowledge became the foundation upon which many of them would help build a new, democratic Germany from the ashes of the old. It's a powerful testament to the fact that even in the darkest conflicts, there can be moments of revelation and seeds of a better future. The war they fought was over, but the lessons they learned would echo for generations. For more untold stories from the Second World War, be sure to subscribe and join our community of history enthusiasts.